the term 剩女 was deliberately pushed by the Chinese government in a propaganda campaign.
After 35, so there's this implicit discriminatory preferences for women in the marriage market.
That kind of radical anti-marriage stance among young women in China has become a lot more noticeable today.
If men don't change their preference, then what you see, there will be inevitable that there will be more and more leftover men.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Now, in the past few months, the leaders of Russia, China, and North Korea have all agreed on one thing: women need to get to work producing children. They made statements urging women to serve their countries by procreating. So this no doubt has put single women under the spotlight. In various cultures, there have long been different terms to describe unmarried women after a certain age. In China, it's leftover women. Japan, Christmas cake, Korea, Miss Gold, and the list goes on. Well, to understand how we as a society view unmarried women and the decline in marriage rates, we're joined by Leta Hong Fincher, the author of Leftover Women. She's a journalist and a research associate at Columbia University in New York. And here in Taipei, we have Yen-hsin Alice Cheng, professor and research fellow from the Institute of Sociology at Academia Sinica. Thank you both so much for being part of this very important conversation. I'm going to start with you, Leta. Your book, Leftover Women, looks at the structural discrimination against women in the context of China's economy, politics, and development. But before we go further into all those factors, can you tell us where that term came about and what that term actually is?
Sure. This term was deliberately pushed by the Chinese government in a propaganda campaign. And so the government itself defined the term 剩女, or leftover woman, to mean a woman who is 27 years old or older, who's educated and single. And so the propaganda, starting in 2007, was extremely sexist and insulting, basically sending the message to young women in China that they need to hurry up and get married and stop thinking about their careers. Otherwise, if they keep delaying marriage, no man will ever want them.
Right, and we'll be talking about that a little further in the program. Alice, you describe yourself as a family demographer. Can you explain?
Okay, so demographers, basically we analyze population statistics and register data. And when you add a family on top of demographer, means that this demographer focuses specifically on union formation and dissolution, which means marriage, divorce, cohabitation, childbearing, and so on and so forth.
One of the pillars of the communist movement was women being equal to men, gender equality. What's happened?
Yes, well, I mean, that's a very good question. Because in the early communist era, Mao Zedong, who was the founder of the People's Republic, famously said that women hold up half the sky. And in fact, the propaganda back then, all the way up until the end of the 1970s, was that women in China need to delay marriage so that they can work longer and contribute to developing the country's economy. But that began to change significantly. Starting in the 1980s, it really accelerated after 2000 in particular, or at the end of the 1990s, with this breakneck economic growth. And then you see all sorts of new forms of sexism emerging, some of it coming directly from the government in the form of propaganda, trying to push women back into traditional roles of wife and mother in the home. Some of it is also kind of more organic, coming from market reforms where employers are no longer required to just hire anybody assigned to them by the state.
That paints such a troubling picture and almost is counterintuitive. You think with economic progress, you will see progress in other parts of society's development. What is the picture here, Alice, with Taiwan's economic progress? What's the trend we're seeing, particularly in the marriage rates?
Okay, so industrialization started in Taiwan in the late 60s or 70s, depend on when you defined it. When industrialization started, you need more educated, skilled labor. So educational expansion is something that's inevitable. So with that, you see women's better schooling, and then higher labor force participation rate, and then fertility within marriage started to decline. And after that, it's this postponement of marriage. Starting in the new millennium, after 2000, a lot of the postponed marriages become marriages forgone. Because, in the entire East Asia, women, I would say after 35, it gets quite difficult for women in the marriage market to find an ideal, suitable partner. People started to doubt and question her fecundity, and because childbearing is one of the key obligation or duty that people imagine when a couple gets married. That's what you should do after getting married. So if they think that, you might have lower fecundity, you are less fertile, maybe I should look for a younger woman. So that's implicit. It's not as, in a way, in Taiwan, it's not as blatant as Leta said, the government's sort of trying to say, women past 27 is like leftover women. But it's somehow, there's this mentality or some kind of, I would say, consensus. It's sad, but it's kind of like that. Like after 35, men, in their late 30s or even early 40s, if they're still single, they will look for younger women. So, so there's this implicit discriminatory preferences for women in the marriage market.
We actually have a graphic just to kind of put what you said in context here. There has been a notable decrease in marriage rates in recent years. Here's the number of marriages for every 1,000 people in China, the United States, South Korea, Japan, Europe, and Taiwan since 1980. And as you can see, it is mostly a decreasing trend. Alice, can you tell us how this reflects the changes in society's view of marriage, given that Taiwan does still uphold traditional values and there's somewhat of a patriarchal system still in play?
I think there's this very deep-rooted family or marriage value that's being sort of practiced in Taiwan, and I think it's not. It's also quite common in the entire East Asia. So the value is traditional, but women's role and their status progressed so fast. It happened within 3 to 4 decades. So the younger generations of women, they were being brought up in this very traditional family-oriented culture. They know that somehow they should get married, but with their advanced education and their achievement in the labor market, they also think that it's not worthwhile to settle for anyone just because you are close to age 30 or you are already 32 or whatever. They want to find the right person or the quote-unquote Mr. Right to get married. So this is somehow this, I would say it's a sort of an intergenerational conflict in value, in a sense. So this created a lot of tensions in a way between women who really want to stick to their standards of finding a partner versus pressures and stress coming from their family or from their boyfriend or whatever. And then on top of that, everything gets even harder because non-marital births in entire East Asia is so low. You really have to get married first, then to have children. And so this growth of non-marriage or unmarried men and women in East Asia is indirectly linked to plummeting fertility rates. So it's total fertility rates in all of these countries are hitting record lows year after year. So that I think that's something what we're observing.
And we can hear from Teresa Zhu, a reproductive rights activist from China. She was denied egg freezing treatment at a Beijing hospital for being unmarried in 2018 and filed a lawsuit that later sparked a national debate over reproductive rights in China.
社会文化或者是一个社会氛围的声音一直在提醒我说，你30岁到35岁，你就是可能是你的这个黄金的生育年龄的一个尾巴，你一定要抓紧这个时间，不然以后你的生育力水平都会断崖式的下跌。然后你可能就没有机会再去在状态比较好的时候去生一个孩子了。我认识的那些单身女性，我都是对她们充满敬意的，因为我觉得社会应该停止这样的污名了，然后也看到单身女性内部的一个多样性吧。大家可能有各种各样的原因，各种各样的出发点而去选择保持现状，或者是就不走入婚姻，或者是选择自己在独立的情况下有一个育儿的有一个生育的规划。我觉得这个就是这些女人就是大家的气魄呀，这个独立性啊，这些决断呢，其实是应该被更多的了解的。
I just wanted to add that, I mean, a key difference between mainland China and Taiwan with regard to marriage is that the government makes it exceedingly difficult for single women to have children in China. There are all these different regulations that are controlling individuals and effectively pushing them into the institution of marriage. So that's been a very powerful force in maintaining marriage rates as higher in China versus Taiwan until quite recently. So just in the last few years, I mean, if we're looking at the falling birth rates in the People's Republic of China in particular, a lot of that is due to individual women pushing back against that very intense marriage pressure that is not just coming from tradition and coming from their parents, but it's also very strongly coming from the state, coming from propaganda and coming from pro-marriage and recently pro-natalist policies. But basically those policies you see today in the People's Republic of China are failing.
Right. I want to bring your attention to this next film, which takes a look at what it's like to be a single woman in Taiwan through a matchmaking agency, which helps coach and pair up singles.
我跟你讲，过了某个年纪之后，女生呢要赶快找对象，赶快嫁了，这样子。
你35岁了，你已经是老妹了呢。
人家说女人是耶诞节前的蛋糕，过了25岁就没价值了。
这么老了还老蚌生珠哦？
这休假没结婚。我觉得其实有时候局限的是外界的观感。其实如果你不在意的话，这些标签都贴不到你身上。我们都是精致的女性，我们为什么要委屈我们自己？我是已经进入40阶段的上班族，目前单身，刚结束一段感情，那目前是在一家科技公司担任人资的工作，所以天天都会看到各式各样不同的人的面貌，尤其是招聘这一块，我觉得就像企业的红娘，我们在面对感情的时候，也会是希望在人海中找到适合自己的对象。人海茫茫，有时候并不容易，我们需要找一些特殊的方法。
这个是男生的资料哈，我们就会帮他设定他想要的年龄、身高、学历跟薪水的部分。乐福里是一个很单纯的联谊公司，乐福里已经成立了大概15年，就是2009年的时候，那时候我也是跟现在很多单身女子一样，是25、26岁的时候，然后那时候因为自己要找对象，就开始成立乐福里。可是那时候婚友社都要好几万块，那我又想找条件比较类似的朋友，所以我就自己办活动，那就后来就办了10几年，我们有大概15万人真实会员报名参加过，然后大概是快2万人结婚哦，对，然后交往率大概是30%几。
你列出3个你绝对要的条件跟绝对不行的条件，你希望是什么？哪3个？对要
相互付出吧。 我觉得不管是到几岁，都有谈恋爱、交朋友的权利。那我觉得，与其谈恋爱这个东西，我觉得要更放在前面的是要对自己诚实。这休假又没结婚，一定要结婚吗？我们很专注我们的工作不行吗？我觉得目前的遇到的男人不好，我为什么要将就呢？这也是我们一个单身的原因，因为我们遇到的对象不够好。毕竟现在女性不一定要结婚嘛，结婚不一定是必须题，它是可以是选择题。
25岁的时候是5年前，然后是我觉得每个人都很想结婚，然后那时候好像不结婚就会被人家觉得说你到底是有什么问题，然后觉得结婚就是圣权。那到了这5到8年，环境改变，大家对于结婚的憧憬没有这么高了。女生工作和学历都很好啊，就觉得我不用像农业社会一样嫁一个这么大的男生，为了他的经济，我现在也可以活得很好，甚至我活得比男生更好。因为台湾还是偏华人，就是比较传统思想、父权主义，他们觉得女生最适合生育的年龄就是30岁或是35岁以内，所以台湾女生在年轻的时候可能都看不上这些男生，可是在35岁到40岁，他们想要定下来的时候，这些男生觉得这些女生就是生育年龄太大了，就算这女生各方面的学经历、工作比她优秀，他还是觉得在他的心中分数不是那么高。如果是以两性市场的话，然后他们就会有点落差这样子。
前一次的活动里头，有个男性跟我这样子直接坦白问我说年纪，讲完年纪之后，他在换到下一个谈论对象之前，他跟我说，我觉得你们这个年纪要把握好，那赶快找对象。那我只是有一点困惑的看他一眼，我心想，你不是也跟我一样吗？因为其实我们几乎算是同年龄。我想，那你不也一样吗？
其实现在很多说法是要政治正确的，不可以讲剩女或败犬，而且如果讲出来是会被旁边人群体围攻。
其实剩女或败犬其实并不是我们自己去写，有些是外界讲嘛。那我觉得不一定是剩下的剩，你可以说胜利的胜，因为我对我自己能够安排得很好，我觉得这也是一件好事。
希望大家有一个美好的未来。
先在意有没有找到对象再说吧，管他年龄的。对象找得到，管你几岁都是好事。那你何必管年龄呢？还是会做白日梦啊，偶尔会讲一些不切实际的话。但是我觉得不管如何，不管哪个年纪，都是最好的自己这样子。
Alice, in a research project you participated in, you'd predicted that in 2040 to 2050, those never married between the ages of 45 to 49 will exceed 30% of the population. Can you explain and tell us what the context to this?
That's a forecast for Taiwan. For China, it's much lower, and Japan and Korea is not so pessimistic. We assume that the marriage, the pairing patterns or pairing preferences observed in 2010 persist throughout these periods. And then we use the population projection, the different proportions of men and women in different ages, along with their marital status, to do the projection. So I think that scenario will only change if men started to change their age preferences in women. But if the 2010 preferences persist, which means men of certain ages, particularly above 35, they prefer women younger than them at least for 5 to 10 years of age, then you will have a very strong marriage squeeze. That's a demographic term, squeeze against men, because we know that birth count has been plummeting since 1970, I think. So 50 years of declining birth count. So the younger cohorts of women you look for, they're going to be smaller in size. So if you cannot appreciate women who are similar age as you are looking for women in a smaller cohort. That means stronger competition for any kind of men. But still, most of the men, once they reach certain age, they're late 30s and 40s, they still prefer young women. And that somehow this unbreakable preference, because you actually see this in all population. If you plot a spousal age gap along men's marriage age, you see the older men get married, the younger their wives are. But in a population like Taiwan or Japan or Korea, where birth count has been declining year after year, if men don't change their preference, then what you see, there will be, it is inevitable that there will be more and more leftover men.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, have the intention to get married, but they cannot find the kind of woman they want because they are too old, but they think they are, of these, they're still very valuable, but in the eyes of women, they don't think it that way, particularly much younger women. But for women who are more similar in age as they do, they probably have higher tolerance toward this older men's age, but these men sort of think that these women who are similar in age to them are not as preferable. So, it's this mismatch of preferences is something that what we saw in the short clip. And it is happening in the society. It's a sort of these invisible forces that's going on, and I would say only demographers notice that because we analyze data all the time.
Right.
And regular people, they were just thinking, I just want someone who can bear children for me. That's all. So
yeah, and basically that's what it comes down to, isn't it? This whole idea of procreation and ability to procreate. So Leta, you revised your book, Leftover Women, and in this new edition, you found that a lot of things had to be updated. Can you give us a sense of kind of the most significant issues you felt that you really, really needed to update, and what that says about China's future when it comes to gender equality and how women are being treated?
Yes, I mean, this new edition of my book is a 10th anniversary edition. So the original research that I did for my book that came out in 2014 was doing extensive interviews, both face-to-face and online, actually, at the time, between 2011 and 2013. A lot of these young women felt very unhappy in their relationships, but they felt that they had to get married because there was just this sense that there wasn't an alternative for them. And that is a striking departure from what has happened over the past decade. Let me just say that I actually interviewed, even back in 2011 to 2013, I did interview some women who were in the minority, but who were militantly anti-marriage, who said, there's no way I'm going to get married. These were young women in their mid-20s who were expressing these rather feminist beliefs. But at the time, that was really quite unusual. So with the revised edition, that kind of radical anti-marriage stance among young women in China has become a lot more noticeable today. If you just look at the statistics, marriage rates actually peaked in China in 2013. And so they've been falling for every consecutive year since then. You've also seen the rise of feminism in China. And in spite of a very brutal anti-feminist crackdown coming from the Chinese government, feminism overall, these beliefs in standing up for your rights as a woman in particular, they're much stronger now. And so it's much more common for especially college-educated young women in mainland China to just resist pressure to marry and say that they just don't want to marry or have a baby at all. There's been a lot more political repression in the People's Republic in the last decade under Xi Jinping. But in spite of that, or maybe even because of it, marriage is much more restrictive now. It's much more difficult to get a divorce in the People's Republic just over the last few years. It's become more difficult for women in particular to get a divorce. So all of these developments over the past decade have made marriage as an institution a lot less attractive for women, which is very paradoxical because the Chinese government is really doubling down on its propaganda and pro-marriage and pro-natalist policies, but they're just alienating the very group that they're trying to entice, these educated young women who are increasingly saying no to marriage and child-rearing pressure.
Right, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time, but thank you both so much for this incredibly interesting and fascinating conversation that we should keep having. Leta Hong Fincher, the author of Leftover Women, and Professor Yen-hsin Alice Cheng from the Institute of Sociology at Academia Sinica. Thank you both so much for your time and being on the program. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, do join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.